This is part 2 of an episode on Dunbar Cave, and we're going to focus on the Native American history and culture today. And it's my pleasure to welcome back to the studio David Britton. He's the park manager of Dunbar Cave State Park. So David, thanks for returning.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'm also curious in how you became connected with the state park there, because you're an alumnus of Austin Peay.
Absolutely.
So tell us that story.
Sure, yeah. So I'm from Clarksville originally. My parents were born here. My grandparents came here in order to work at that time was the new Memorial Hospital when it was at its old location. And so consider myself a Clarksville native. And I was working elsewhere and living at Port Royal, in the community of Port Royal, where my grandmother lived and my father grew up, and had become involved with the Friends group for Port Royal at the time. So I had become the president of the Friends group. And through a drawn-out process, I eventually became aware, let's say, of that being a park ranger was a career option. And I had an opportunity to join the staff at Dunbar Cave in Port Royal as a maintenance person. And so I jumped on as a maintenance person and worked there, came to Austin Peay, had to finish a degree, so I came to Austin Peay and did a degree in history with the history department here. And forged, even today, lifelong connections with professors that are and mentors that still aid me today. So I will always speak very highly of my experience at Austin Peay and at the history department. So then from there, after I finished the degree, I went to Bicentennial Capitol Mall State Park in the shadow of the state capitol, the State House, downtown Nashville. I was there for several years as a law enforcement ranger, and then came here as the park manager in 2017. Initially as interim, and then as the full manager, and still here.
That's a great story.
So,
we love to hear success stories.
Yeah.
That's really a fun one, too. So the site was also important during the 20s, what was it, 30s, 40s, and 50s, really?
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Dunbar Cave and the adjoining property called Idaho Springs across Dunbar Cave Road were both competing resorts. And so it's important to understand that actually goes back before the American Civil War, that there was attempts made at making these places of resort. So by the time the 20th century rolled around, especially in the 1920s, there were efforts having music at the cave. But 1933 is really where it was cemented in a concerted effort through the Idaho Springs Corporation. That's the name of the company that merged the properties and began hosting big band dances and performances there. They built the concrete dance floor that you see today with the arches and the concession stand and the bandstand. So all that came about in 1933. And so anybody who was anybody in the big band era performed there. And caves as performance venues are a very interesting part of the American musical tradition and heritage. I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous across the country, especially here in the South. And that's because caves produce cold air. That's the same reason that people were attracted to it 10,000 years ago, is it has cold air coming out, and it's warm air in the wintertime because it's always 56 degrees blowing outside of that cave. So that attracts folks there. And so during the 30s, the big bands were rocking and rolling there. But in 1948, Roy Acuff, the godfather of country music, the father of modern country music, he has a few different titles. He purchased the area and morphed it into a country music park, which is important because he is instrumental in the creation of modern country music as a pop music format, right? And so this was part of that process of bringing Appalachian music, folk music to the masses, right? And so he did that through Dunbar Cave by having performances there. He built a huge amphitheater on the side of the lake where they had the Opry would perform in Nashville. The next day they come up and perform at Dunbar. He ran a radio show out of there. So that's the era that most folks remember. But he even continued the big band stuff, I think, on Friday nights there at the Cave. But the big country music performances were in the big amphitheater, which is no longer there. But in the late 60s, it was pretty evident that the place was losing money. So he sold it, got out of that business. Of course, what's interesting is he quickly reinvested in the beginnings of Opryland. And so Opryland has a lot of the same features that Dunbar Cave had at that time. So we like to interpret that Roy Acuff's Dunbar Cave was a blueprint for beginning Opryland, for those who remember Opryland, the country music park that was in Nashville. But yeah, and so a few more attempts were made at keeping the resort around the cave rolling. It was not lucrative in any capacity, and folks were losing money, and so it was eventually shut down and abandoned.
Okay.
And then that's when the state took it over in 1973.
Well, I wanted to thank you for coming today and thank everybody for listening. This was an episode of The Human Scape of Clarksville, produced by the Institute for the Public Humanities. And thanks everybody for tuning in for this episode on Dunbar Cave and its cultural history. Thank you.